She grabbed the sleeve of the most dangerous man in the room and whispered 6 words that would detonate the rest of her life. "Tell him you're with me, please." The man she'd grabbed, whose name alone made federal agents reach for antacids and rival families reach for lawyers, looked down at her fingers curled against the fine wool of his jacket. Then he raised his eyes to the food critic standing 3 feet away with that familiar, slow-rolling smirk. He didn't deliberate. He didn't perform. "She is," Enzo Caruso said, and he was not pretending. Delia Harmon was, by every professional measure, exceptional. At 32, she was the executive pastry chef at the Grand Meridian Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, a position she'd clawed her way into over a decade of pre-dawn kitchen calls, burned forearms, and dessert tastings with sous chefs who didn't believe in sleep. She had a James Beard semi-finalist nomination under her belt and a pastry program that Food and Wine had called quietly revolutionary. What she was not, in the estimation of Reed Coulter, was presentable. Reed was the kind of man who had learned to weaponize taste. He'd spent 12 years building a reputation as New York's most feared culinary critic, the kind of column that could halve a restaurant's reservation list with a single paragraph. He had neat, sandy hair and a jaw that photographed well, and he wore his authority the way men who've never been told no always do, casually, like it was just physics. He and Delia had dated for 14 months. She had been foolish enough to believe he saw her, really saw her, the way she moved through a kitchen, the way she could reconstruct a flavor memory from a single bite and turn it into something that made people forget their problems for the length of a dessert course. She was a size 18 and had spent her entire adult life being treated like that was a confession of failure. Reed had seemed, briefly, like someone who understood that the number on a tag meant nothing. Then he'd been invited to a high-profile industry dinner. He'd looked at Delia in the hotel lobby beforehand, in the emerald wrap dress she'd spent 2 weeks deciding on, and said, very quietly, "I don't think tonight is a good night for you to come." She'd asked why. He'd said, "There will be cameras." She hadn't gone to the dinner. She'd sat in her apartment in Astoria and eaten cold sesame noodles and understood, in the hollow, clinical way you understand things that hurt too much to feel immediately, that the relationship was already over. She'd ended it herself the following morning. Reed had not argued. He had simply nodded, as if confirming a suspicion he'd held all along. What she hadn't anticipated was that he'd spend the next 18 months turning his column into a slow-release toxin aimed specifically at her career. Nothing actionable. Just references, here and there, to technically proficient but emotionally overwrought pastry programs. A mention, in a piece ostensibly about tasting menus, that certain chefs confuse volume with excellence. Small enough that she couldn't point to it, targeted enough that everyone in her industry could read the address. She'd tried to simply outwork him. It was the only strategy she knew. The night of the James Beard Foundation Gala, Delia wore a deep burgundy gown and spent the first 40 minutes of the evening navigating congratulations from people who respected her work, and the occasional tightening around the eyes from people who'd read Reed's column recently. She was standing near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, watching the city's lights stack up against the dark, when she heard his voice. Delia, the way Reed said her name had always felt like a door being closed. He looked exactly the same. Men like Reed didn't carry the weight of what they'd done. They moved through the world with the particular lightness that belonged to people who had never truly been held accountable. Still doing the Meridian thing? He glanced at her sparkling water, then at her body. In the practiced sweep, she recognized the inventory check, like she was property being assessed for flood damage. Good for you, staying in your lane. Reed, her voice was even, she'd practiced even. I saw the spring menu right up in Eater. He tilted his head, solid, safe. I always said you were technically competent. He said it the way people say bless your heart. I'm doing a piece next month on the new wave of pastry innovation in the city. I wasn't going to include the Meridian, but I could give you a line. Something encouraging. The condescension was almost architectural. It had load-bearing walls. I don't need a line, Reed. No. He stepped closer, dropping his voice into the register she recognized as his real one, the one that existed beneath the performance of civility. Still showing up to these things alone, I see. You'd think by now you'd have figured out that some rooms aren't built for. He let the pause do the work, his eyes moving down her body and back up. Everyone. The old shame moved through her like weather, that specific, suffocating feeling she'd carried since she was 16. The feeling that she was too much and not enough simultaneously, that she took up the wrong kind of space. She could feel her throat tightening. She stepped back and stepped directly into someone. She turned automatically to apologize and found herself looking at a white dress shirt, open at the collar, beneath a charcoal jacket that looked like it had been made for the specific geometry of the body wearing it. She looked up. The man was tall in the way that reorganized the space around him. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been decided upon rather than grown. There were 2 faint scars above his left eyebrow, thin as thread, the kind that didn't come from accidents. He was holding a whiskey glass with the looseness of a man who was completely comfortable in every room he'd ever entered. She recognized the name from the VIP registry she'd reviewed as part of the Meridian's event planning. Enzo Caruso, listed publicly as the founder of Caruso Hospitality Group, one of the fastest-growing luxury hotel brands on the East Coast, known in entirely different circles for entirely different reasons. She didn't think. Her body moved before her mind could stop it. She grabbed his sleeve. "Tell him you're with me," she whispered, her voice shaking, her eyes communicating everything her words couldn't. A half-second of absolute silence. Enzo looked at her, not at her body, not at the space she occupied. At her, a direct, unhurried look that took in the brightness in her eyes that was either tears or fury or both. Then he looked at Reed. "She is," Enzo said, and wrapped his arm around her waist. The warmth of him was immediate and staggering. He pulled her into his side like it was where she'd always stood, with the ease of a man who had no need to perform anything for anyone. He looked at Reed Coulter the way a man looks at something small that has briefly landed on his sleeve. "I don't believe we've met," Enzo said pleasantly. Reed's smirk had calcified. "Reed Coulter, I write. I know who you are." The pleasantness didn't move. It was the pleasantness of a man who has already made a decision and is waiting for the other party to understand it. "You were just leaving." It wasn't a question. Reed Coulter stared at Enzo Caruso for 4 full seconds, recalibrated something behind his eyes, and walked away. Delia pulled back immediately, putting distance between herself and the wall of warmth that had just upended her nervous system. "I am so sorry," she said. "I panicked. I know who you are, and I know that was completely. I'm sorry. I'll cover your drink tab. You'll stop apologizing. A full stop, but not unkind." He looked at her steadily. "He does that often." "The performance?" "Often enough. We used to date. It was a mistake. He's had a field day with it ever since." Enzo considered this your name. "Delia Harmon, executive pastry chef, Grand Meridian." "Your black sesame millefeuille," he said. "Michelin event March. Best thing I ate all year." He said it like a fact, not a compliment. "Walk with me." She did not know why she followed him. She would spend a significant amount of time afterward being baffled by this. But there was something about the way Enzo Caruso occupied space, certain, unhurried, entirely without theater, that made following him feel like the only sensible option available. He found a quiet corner near the bar, away from the noise, and turned to face her. "You need him to stop," Enzo said, "not a ceasefire, an ending." "I need to build a body of work that makes his opinion irrelevant," she said. "That would take years, and he'd keep chipping in the meantime." He turned his glass slowly. "I have a different proposal. I'm opening a new property. The Caruso Grand here in Manhattan. I need someone to helm the culinary program. Not a hired hand, a genuine creative partner with a real reputation. Someone who makes every room she walks into understand exactly who she is. He paused. The FBI has been building a case against my organization for 2 years. They want to paint me as a man who belongs in the dark. A legitimate, visible partnership with someone of your professional standing does what 12 lawyers cannot. It changes the story. She looked at him. You want me to be your cover? I want you to be my partner. Publicly. For 4 months, full creative control over the Caruso Grand's culinary identity. A salary that would fund your own restaurant afterward, the kind of visibility that makes Reed Coulter's column read like a grocery circular. He held her gaze. In exchange, you attend events on my arm. You're photographed with me. You give the FBI reason to reconsider their narrative. Delia Harmon had built her entire life on calculated risk. You didn't develop a pastry program from scratch in one of the most competitive culinary cities on Earth by playing it safe. She looked at Enzo, the danger in him as obvious as his bone structure, and thought about Reed's eyes moving down her body in that slow, deliberate inventory. About 18 months of small cruelties, dressed up as professional criticism. About the restaurant she'd been dreaming of for 6 years, and couldn't get backed because investors who came to preview tastings always seemed vaguely surprised that someone who looked like her was responsible for what they'd just eaten. 4 months, she said. 4 months. She made him wait long enough to be clear that she was choosing, not conceding. Deal. What followed was a week that bore no resemblance to anything in Delia's previous life. She was moved from her Astoria apartment in the Caruso Grand's finished upper floors, partially open, impeccably completed, the kind of space that made her feel like she'd accidentally stepped into someone else's entirely different existence. Floor-to-ceiling windows over the Hudson. A kitchen fitted with equipment she'd been putting on wish lists for years. Enzo was not what she'd expected. She'd anticipated coldness, the particular emotional barrenness of powerful men who'd never had to be anything other than powerful. What she got was a man who actually read the briefing documents she sent over on the culinary concept, who had opinions specific, considered, occasionally wrong but always engageable, about the dessert program, who noticed things. On the 3rd day, he appeared in the doorway of the sweet kitchen while she was stress-baking croissants at midnight, and stood there watching without comment until she said, "What? You're rushing the fold." She set down the bench scraper. "I have been making croissants since I was 17 years old. And you've been rushing the fold for 17 years. He walked in, unhurried, and stood beside her at the counter. His sleeves were rolled up, and she could see the tattoo running the length of his left forearm, something in Italian she didn't try to read. He demonstrated the adjustment, hands sure and practiced. "My grandmother's bakery, Palermo, every summer until I was 12. She looked at him. The head of the Caruso family learned to make croissants in his grandmother's bakery in Palermo. The head of the Caruso family had a grandmother. He stepped back, finish the lamination, then sleep. We have the Vista Foundation dinner Friday." She didn't sleep, but the croissants were extraordinary. The Vista Foundation dinner was at the Metropolitan Club. Old money, new money, and the press that documented both. A stylist arrived that afternoon with a rack of gowns and absolutely no interest in making Delia look smaller. "The burgundy is safe," the stylist said, moving through the options, "but this," she produced a gown in deep cobalt, structured at the bodice, the skirt dramatic and unapologetic. "This is a statement." "I'm not really a statement person," Delia said. "You're about to be." Enzo was in the lobby when she came downstairs. He turned when the elevator opened and looked at her. Not the scan she'd been trained to expect. Not the assessment and adjustment of a man recalculating whether she met some private standard. He looked at her the way her best pastry looked when she pulled it from the oven, with the quiet satisfaction of something that had come out exactly right. "You look like someone who belongs in every room she walks into," he said. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it somewhere she didn't have access to in public and got in the car. The Metropolitan Club shifted when they entered. Subtle. The slight recalibration of attention that happens when a room understands that something significant has arrived. Enzo's hand was warm and steady at the small of her back, a counterweight to the old anxiety that told her she was being looked at wrong. She wasn't. She could tell the difference, even if she hadn't had much practice. Reed was there. Of course he was. It was the kind of event Reed lived for. He saw Delia, then he saw who she was with. She watched his face do something complicated and private and deeply satisfying. Enzo introduced her by name and credential to people whose names appeared on buildings, and he did it with a possessiveness that was too specific to be performance, his attention returning to her even mid-conversation with people who expected to command it entirely. When she spoke about the Caruso Grand's culinary vision, he listened with the focused interest of someone who had not already decided what he thought. She was at the bar refilling her water when Reed appeared at her elbow. "Who's paying him?" he said, under the room's noise. His voice had the edge she recognized as jealousy wearing the costume of concern. "Because whatever it is, it won't be worth it when people find out what Caruso actually is." Delia turned to look at him fully. "I think you should go back to wherever you were standing." "I'm looking out for you." He said it like he believed it. "A woman in your position." "My position." Her voice was steady in a way she had worked very hard to make it. "I'm the executive pastry chef at one of the most recognized hotels in this city. I'm the creative director of a major new culinary property. And I'm at this event on the arm of a man who has never once made me feel like my presence was a problem." She held his gaze. "Be very clear about what my position actually is." Something moved behind his eyes. He opened his mouth. A hand came down on the back of Reed Coulter's shoulder, not violently, with a control that was more frightening than violence. The precision of a man who knows exactly how much pressure communicates exactly enough. Enzo leaned close to Reed's ear. "This is the second time," he said quietly. "There will not be a third conversation. Nod if you understand." Reed nodded. His face had gone a color that didn't photograph well. "Good." Enzo released him and turned to Delia, his expression instantly completely different, open, the sharpness replaced by something warmer. "Shall we find our table? I believe they're doing the dessert course." She took his arm. They were halfway across the room when the sound came. Delia's first thought was that something had shattered, a serving tray, maybe, a stack of glassware. Her second thought arrived within a half-second of the first and was already behind the pace of events. The sound had come from the wrong direction for glassware. Her third thought was that Enzo's body was already in front of hers. He didn't push her aside. He repositioned, one fluid, practiced movement that placed his entire frame between her body and the northeast entrance to the ballroom, where two men in dark tactical gear had come through a service door that wasn't supposed to be accessible. The screaming started a beat later, as the room caught up to what was already happening. "Stay directly behind me," Enzo said, and his voice had completely changed, not cold, efficient. The voice of a man who had been trained for this, the way she'd been trained for her kitchen. "Do not stop moving." He had a firearm. She didn't know where it had come from. He kept her at his back as he moved her toward the kitchen corridor, while his security, 3 men she'd barely registered all evening, materialized from different points around the ballroom and created a controlled perimeter. The sounds coming from behind them were something she chose not to process in real time. The service corridor smelled like dish soap and the catering company's rosemary chicken. Enzo moved through it at speed, one hand keeping her immediately behind him, and she focused on the back of his head and kept her feet moving. A black SUV idled in the delivery bay. They were inside it before she had fully understood they were running. Inside the vehicle, in the hum of the city outside darkened windows, Delia noticed the spreading stain along Enzo's left arm. She reached for it before she made a conscious decision to. You're hit. Graze, entirely unreasonable tone for the circumstances. Are you? I'm fine. She was already moving. She grabbed the hem of her cobalt gown. The fabric was extraordinary. It was going to cost a significant amount of money, and she genuinely did not care at all. She tore a strip from the hem, a clean rip, long and useful, and pressed it against the wound. He hissed. His eyes found hers in the dark interior. That dress, he said, is worth more than your monthly salary. Add it to the tab. Her hands were shaking slightly. She kept them moving anyway. He watched her face while she worked. Not her hands, her face. She became aware of it, the specific quality of his attention, and chose to ignore it in favor of maintaining pressure on a gunshot wound. The Vashchenko family, he said after a moment. The warm cadence was gone from his voice. A rival organization. They had information about my schedule. Information that is not public. They knew exactly where I would be standing and at what time. Delia's hands went still. The event was invitation only, he continued. My movements are not published. The people who knew my schedule tonight were the foundation board, the hotel's event team. He paused, and the press guests who received advance notice of my attendance, which would include food media. The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the car. Read, she said. It didn't feel like a question. My security pulled the external camera footage. 22 minutes before the shooting, Reed Coulter stepped outside through the Fifth Avenue entrance and placed a phone call. He did not return for 11 minutes. Delia sat back. The weight of it settled over her. Not like shock, exactly, but like the moment you finally understand the shape of something you've been in the dark about for a long time. The man who had spent 18 months carving small pieces from her professional reputation, who had looked at her body in that lobby like an itemized list of failures, who had pointed his slow, corrosive contempt at her career because she'd been the one with the clarity to leave. He had handed her location to men with weapons. He didn't care that I was standing next to you, she said. Her voice was very quiet. No, Enzo said. His jaw was tight. He did not. What are you going to do? He looked at her for a long moment. I'm going to take everything he has built. He said it with the calm of someone who has already decided. But I need you to tell me something first. Do you still feel anything for him? Anything at all? Delia thought about Reed's voice in the hotel lobby. There will be cameras. The column. The smirk at the Gala. The 22 minutes in the cold outside a ballroom where he had just told a rival syndicate where to aim. Nothing, she said. I haven't for a long time. I was just too busy surviving him to notice. Something shifted in Enzo's expression. Something that opened, briefly, before he contained it again. He nodded once. Sleep. We're going to the Connecticut property tonight. What followed took 2 weeks, and no one in Reed Coulter's professional world saw any of it coming. The Vashchenko operatives were arrested within 48 hours. Anonymous tips to 2 separate federal agencies, filed through channels that would have required considerable resources to construct and left no traceable origin. The Vashchenko family, suddenly occupied with a federal conspiracy indictment, had no bandwidth for anything else. Reed's column appeared on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, the magazine that ran it had quietly lost 3 of its major advertising partners, all of them connected, in ways that would take forensic accounting to fully trace to holding companies within the Caruso's hospitality network. By Friday, Reed had been asked to take a leave of absence while the publication restructured its food coverage. On Monday, federal investigators received a package. It contained telecommunications records from a cell phone registered to Reed Coulter, documenting a 12-minute call placed at 9:43 p.m. on the night of the Vista Foundation dinner to a number belonging to a known associate of the Vashchenko organization. Reed was arrested at his Tribeca apartment the following morning in front of the news cameras that were, by careful design, already in position. Delia watched it from the Connecticut property. A stone house on 7 acres that operated at a remove from everything, guarded and quiet and smelling of wood smoke from the fireplace Enzo had lit against the October chill. She sat in a wool sweater that wasn't hers, with a mug of coffee she'd made in a kitchen better equipped than most professional operations, and felt something unwind in her chest that she hadn't known was coiled there. "Closure?" Enzo asked from across the room. He was at the desk, working, jacket off, sleeves rolled. He'd been watching her watch the television. "Something like that." She turned from the screen, more like finishing a sentence I'd been holding for 2 years. She set down the mug, the arrangement, the 4 months. 8 weeks remain. "I know." She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. "I know we built this to be temporary. The FBI has moved its focus. The Caruso Grand's culinary program is in solid shape. What you needed me for is essentially handled." She was very careful with her voice. "I want you to know I won't discuss any of this with anyone. You have my word." Enzo had stopped working. He was looking at her across the room with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something intent and still, like a man who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. "You think the arrangement is over," he said. "Isn't it?" He stood. He crossed the room with the unhurried certainty he brought to every space he entered and stopped in front of her. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket where it hung over the back of a chair and produced a small box. Dark velvet, simple. Delia stopped breathing. Enzo Caruso, who had been described in federal documents as the primary organizational authority of the most disciplined criminal syndicate operating in the northeastern United States, went down on one knee on the flagstone floor of a Connecticut farmhouse and opened the box. The ring inside was extraordinary, an emerald-cut diamond set in platinum, surrounded by smaller stones, vivid and clear and enormous in the understated way that real things tend to be. "The arrangement is over," he said, and his voice was different now, not the efficient, contained register he used for business, but something that had been kept back for some time and was done waiting. "I have no interest in pretending anymore, Delia. Not since the night you tore that dress apart to bandage my arm and didn't hesitate for a single second." He paused. "You are the most brilliant, most fearless person I have sat across a table from in 20 years. You make everyone around you want to be better at what they do. And every time I walk into a room with you, I have to remind myself the arrangement was supposed to be temporary." Her eyes were wet. She didn't move to do anything about it. "I don't want 4 months, Enzo said. "I want every room from here forward. I want to watch you build the restaurant you've been designing in your head since before we met. I want to lose arguments about lamination at midnight because you are right, and I only start them to hear you defend yourself." He held the box steady, completely still. "Marry me. For real. Build something permanent with a man who will spend the rest of his life making sure you know exactly what you're worth." Delia Harmon looked at the man on one knee in front of her. She thought about 17 years of professional kitchens and the specific durable confidence she'd built there, 1 degree at a time, 1 dish at a time, in rooms full of people who had underestimated her and been proven wrong. She thought about Reed's voice, and then she thought, deliberately, as an act of will, about letting it go completely and never picking it up again. She thought about Enzo's hand at the small of her back. The way he said her name like it meant exactly what it was. The croissants at midnight and the cobalt dress and the man who had covered her with his own body in a ballroom full of gunfire without a moment's calculation. She slid off the chair and into his arms. "Yes," she said against the warmth of his shoulder. "Obviously, yes." He held her with a completeness she had stopped believing existed. When he slid the ring onto her finger, it felt nothing like an ending. It felt like the first sentence of something that was going to take a very long time to finish. And that was exactly the point. Delia Harmon, who had spent years being told she was too much by men who were nowhere near enough, walked into the rest of her life exactly as she was, certain, fearless, and absolutely finished apologizing for the space she occupied.